church? Hell no. Are you no longer feeling comfortable in church? This podcast is for individuals who are desperately missing God, but don't know how to find Him. Substance abuse, domestic violence, sex offenses, acrimonious divorce can contribute to discomfort in the church. For these individuals, church is just not an option anymore. Ordained minister Dennis Hall and his guests invite you to listen to this podcast for topics that are inspiring, uplifting, and will bring hope to those who just feel church is not relevant in their lives today.
I'm Dr. Dennis Hall, and I'm delighted that you're listening to our podcast today. I don't know about you, but I'm like millions of other Americans. I've grown increasingly concerned about corruption in the judicial system. You know, right now there's dozens and dozens of cases against the Trump administration that have to do with immigration laws and tariff laws and dismissals of federal employees. You know, all things that the American people voted the Trump administration in to do. And the judicial system, at least parts of the judicial system, seem to be laying down roadblocks. And, these judges, for the most part, seem to be sort of left-wing judges. And it just raises our eyebrows about a lot of things. You know, I've become increasingly concerned about corruption in the judicial system. So while I was chief executive officer of a major healthcare system, I witnessed corruption in court cases in both the civil and malpractice trials. And there's no question that many people across the country thought they were witnessing courtroom corruption and found it on display in the actions that were brought against President Trump. You know, he was accused of sexually abusing a woman in 1996, almost 30 years ago, supposedly in a relatively public dressing room in a large department store in New York City. There was no evidence except her allegation. None. No evidence except her allegation. And Trump said he's never met this woman. He doesn't know her. And even with such flimsy evidence, the court awarded his accuser millions of dollars. You know, in another case, a Manhattan trial judge found that Trump and his adult sons, Don Jr. and Eric, and several business associates had fraudulently inflated his net worth to obtain favorable rates from banks and insurers. Now, the banks testified that they didn't have any problem with the loan application or the valuations, and that he had repaid the loans on time. You know, at the time, the judge issued a $5 million, you hear that number? $5 million judgment. The judge's actions were considered politically motivated and legally baseless and grossly excessive by many across the spectrum of U.S. citizens. Now, that $5 million judgment has now been thrown out by an appeals court. And Trump was also prosecuted for supposedly having a couple of boxes of classified documents at his Mar-a-Lago residence. You know, some refer to this case as the overdue book case. There seemed to be no merit to it, and the trial judge eventually dismissed the case. You know, all these efforts aimed at President Trump appear to be politically motivated and, serve to cause the judicial system to be viewed as corrupt by a large sector of the public. In fact, according to the Gallup poll, Americans' confidence in the nation's judicial system and courts dropped to a record low 35% last year. Only 35% of Americans have confidence in the judicial system in America. Few countries and territories have seen larger percentage point drops in confidence in the judiciary than the U.S. So, according to the Gallup poll, the 17-point drop under President Biden signals that something very profound has occurred that may have to do with the various legal cases against Trump. Less than half of Americans today are confident in the honesty of elections. And when you couple that with the fact that only 35% of Americans trust the judicial system, these dynamics spell trouble for our society. Confidence in the rule of law is fundamental to a free society. The news organization Politico recently reported that the country's left and right political flanks that are usually endlessly divided on virtually every big question in national life both agree, however, that the American justice system is simply not on the level. They reported that the notion that the nation's legal system, from the Supreme Court on down, is hopelessly compromised by bias and partisan agendas. And this is now the fundamental assumption across wide swaths of both the conservative and progressive movements. Now, everybody recognizes that political views have always influenced courts, but we're in a new age when the majority of the public have concluded that the judiciary and the courts are corrupt. This spells trouble for our society. The American people, they're not only observing what happens to high-profile political figures and business leaders, but they're also aware that state and local judges are repeatedly escaping public accountability for misdeeds that have victimized thousands of average citizens. 9 out of 10 of these judges are able to keep their jobs, even after their misconduct becomes public. Alabama Judge Les Hayes once sentenced a single mother to 496 days, almost 500 days behind bars. For what? Because she failed to pay traffic fines. This poor woman, this sentence was so stiff that it exceeded jail time that Alabama allows for negligent homicide. While this single mother was serving her time in jail, her 3 women were cast into foster care, with the result that one daughter was molested and another physically abused. The single mother now says that these girls and her family will never be the same. This judge was suspended, but guess what? He was allowed to return to the bench. The conduct of some of these judges who are allowed to return to the bench is simply appalling. They include a California judge who had sex in the courthouse chambers with his former law intern, and then separately with an attorney. A New York judge was found to regularly berate domestic violence victims. And a Maryland judge who, after his arrest for driving drunk, was allowed to return to the bench provided he took a breathalyzer test before each appearance. Are you kidding me? In Utah, a judge texted a video of a man's scrotum to court clerks. He was reprimanded, yes, but he remains on the bench. In Indiana, 3 judges attending a conference last spring got drunk and apparently was in a 3 a.m. brawl outside a White Castle fast food restaurant that ended in 2 of the judges being shot. Each returned to the bench after a short suspension. The public's observing these situations at the local level and beginning to conclude that there are problems with the integrity and honesty of the court system. Why? Because judges are not being held accountable. It looks to the public like it's just the good old boys club. Our country's approximately 1,700 federal judges hear 400,000 cases annually. And the nearly 30,000 state, county, and municipal court judges handle a far bigger document, more than 100 million new cases each year. From traffic to divorce to murder. Their titles range from Justice of the Peace to state Supreme Court justices. And their powers are vast and varied. From determining whether a defendant should be jailed to deciding who gets custody of a child. It's obvious that most states afford judges accused of misconduct a very gentle kind of justice. Just a slap in the face to those who've been harmed by the misconduct of judges. So what is corruption? It's the dishonest, unethical, and illegal behavior by those in positions of power. It involves the abuse of entrusted authority for personal or corporate gain. Yes, or corporate gain. Dishonesty and dishonest behavior can include bribery or embezzlement or fraud, misstatement of facts. Abuse of authority. Abuse of authority leads to corruptions when officials misuse their power for personal gain or the benefit of their corporation. Sometimes it involves accepting money or favors in exchange for services. It's generally thought that there are 3 types of corruption. First, there's political corruption that involves government officials acting for personal gain. We saw a good example of this earlier this year when former Senator Bob Menendez of New Jersey was sentenced to 11 years in prison for abusing the power of his office in exchange for bribes. The judge in this case said that Menendez had become a corrupt politician as he ticked off the spoils of Menendez's corruption. Gold bars, cash, an expensive automobile, bribes. Many Americans are convinced that political corruption is commonplace as they observe elected officials becoming rich while serving in office. And then second, there is corporate corruption, which sometimes involves businesses bribing officials to secure contracts and favorable treatment. In fact, as part of the Menendez trial, the businessmen who paid him bribes were also sentenced to long prison terms, as it should be. And then thirdly, we have what is called systemic corruption. This is when widespread corruption is just ingrained in the processes of an organization or the judiciary system of our society. When we say systemic corruption, it moves beyond just isolated incidents. It describes a situation where corruption is not just occasional, but it's deeply ingrained in the very fabric of an organization or our society or even the judicial system. Now, you can think of it like this. Imagine a single rotten apple in a barrel. That's individual. That's individual corruption. Now imagine that the barrel itself is contaminated, causing all the apples, all the healthy apples to rot over time. This is systemic corruption. Let me break down the fundamental aspects of systemic corruption. It's not simply about individuals making poor choices. It's about the environment in which those choices are made. Systemic corruption is sometimes the result of weak institutions, institutions that have become fragile or ineffective. When regulatory bodies or law enforcement or the judiciary, when they become weak, they cannot act as a check and balance. And corruption begins to spread and become commonplace. It's been said that secrecy breeds corruption. In other words, when there's a lack of transparency, it becomes a breeding ground for corruption. It becomes easier for unethical practices to flourish. And when it comes to our court system, nobody is really monitoring what is happening in specialized areas like worker compensation courts. And then we have the problem that I've already alluded to. If corrupt acts go unpunished, or if punishments are lenient and inconsistent, it sends a signal that corruption is tolerated. This creates a culture of impunity where individuals feel that they can engage in corrupt behavior without any significant consequences. Sometimes we see that this happens when a company begins cutting corners on safety regulations so that they can meet the production targets established by executive leadership. The result is that the unsafe practices become commonplace. Systemic corruption most often is about the subtle erosion of ethical standards within a system. Corrupt practice, but they become normalized and accepted. Accepted as, well, this is just the way things are done. This is just the way things are done. Systemic corruption is when unethical behavior is no longer the exception. It becomes the norm. It's built into the very fabric of how institutions operate. And the long-term consequences of systemic corruption, it extends beyond economic and environmental costs. It erodes trust in institutions. It weakens our social cohesion. Then undermines the rule of law. I've had a up-close front row seat to an area of systemic corruption. This area exists in the worker compensation courts. Now, we have all heard about fraudulent claims made by workers for worker compensation and benefits. Worker compensation companies, they have to hire investigators to go out and expose fraudulent claims. A good example would be a worker who claims his leg was injured at work and he can no longer walk, let alone come back to work. And then an investigator finds that he's playing on the community softball. This kind of fraud is unacceptable. Unacceptable. And it's estimated that the cost to our country is over $7 billion per year in fraudulent worker compensation claims. Sometimes doctors and work comp attorneys and therapists have joined in conspiracies to defraud a work comp company. Now, caught these people go to prison. Yeah. But this is not the area of systemic corruption that I'm talking about. I'm talking about what seems to be happening on a frequent basis to individuals who've been truly disabled by a work-related accident. The case I'm thinking about is an individual who was involved in an accident in a company car while on the way to a company appointment. He was extensively injured in the accident to the point that the trauma surgeons did not even think he would live. And after spending weeks in a coma, his doctors felt that he'd be cognitively disabled, perhaps even in a vegetative state. However, he did survive. And after some 30 surgeries that left him totally disabled with some cognitive issues, totally disabled. All his doctors, the Social Security Administration, and the Veterans Administration consider him totally disabled. Now, after paying this victim benefits for several years, the work comp company requested a second medical opinion. This disabled veteran overslept on the morning of the second medical opinion. And even though he had immediately attempted to reschedule the appointment, the work comp company immediately canceled all his benefits and accused him of refusing to go to the second medical opinion appointment. When most doctors meet this man, they can't even believe that he's still alive with the extensiveness of his injuries. Now, somewhere along the way, he took some non-prescribed painkillers to help deal with his extraordinary pain syndrome. And as a result of that, the work comp company, has accused him of some kind of fraud. And for the past 3 years, this man has not received any benefits. The work comp company has offered to settle his claim at a small fraction of what he's owed. And his attorneys have advised him that this is normal practice by work comp companies. Corruption. And that they'll drag this out long enough that he eventually settles for whatever they offer. Not one person, no one, not any doctor has disputed the fact that he is totally disabled as a result of this workplace accident. Now, from my perspective, this is unadulterated systemic corruption. The attorneys, the mediators, and all those in the work comp court seem to accept the fact that this is just the way it is. This is just the way it is. Systemic corruption. To deal with this systemic corruption in the work comp arena, it appears that a new area of law is emerging that permits suing these companies for bad faith. They call these bad faith cases. This is when the victim sues the insurance company for failing to behave in a reasonable and fair manner. One way to look at bad faith actions is to ask whether the insurance company's decision defies all logic, as in the case of the man I just described. Corruption, as depicted in the Bible, is moral and spiritual decay that leads individuals, corporations, and entire societies away from righteous standards. It's often associated with dishonesty, bribery, and the perversion of justice, as exemplified in the work comp example that I just gave. In the Old Testament, corruption is frequently condemned by the prophets, and it's seen as a major reason for divine judgment. The book of Micah highlights the pervasiveness of corruption among Israel's leaders when it says, leaders judge for a bribe, their priests teach for a price, and her prophets practice divination for money. Yet they lean upon the Lord, saying, is not the Lord among us? No disaster will come upon us. Micah 3:11. This passage illustrates how corruption can lead to a false sense of security and spiritual blindness. It underscores the idea that corruption can bring about communal suffering. And by that, I mean suffering of an entire nation, mate. And then the possibility of divine retribution. The wisdom literature of the Bible also addresses the consequences of corruption. Proverbs warns against dishonest gain when it says, ill-gotten treasures profit nothing, but righteousness delivers from death. Proverbs 10:2. Now, this proverb emphasizes that while corruption may offer temporary benefits, it ultimately leads to spiritual and sometimes physical ruin. The prophets frequently warned Israel and Judah about the dangers of corruption. Isaiah lamented that he lamented the moral decay of Jerusalem, saying, your rulers are rebels, friends of thieves. They love bribes and chase after gifts. They do not defend the fatherless, and the plea of the widow never comes before them. Isaiah 1:23. Yes. Does anybody care about the truly disabled going through the work comp courts? Apparently, a wide group of people are okay with them just being beat down by work comp companies until they submit. Such corruption that was talked about in Isaiah led to social injustice, and it was a key factor in the eventual exile of both kingdoms. And we see those who are truly disabled being denied benefits by work comp companies. What we're observing is a whole group of people being subjected to social injustice. Corruption is a term that resonates deeply within the context of the Bible, encompassing not just moral decay, but also the perversion of justice, truth, and spiritual integrity. Now, the concept of corruption it's multifaceted, affecting individuals and corporations and communities and even nations. There's extraordinary archaeological evidence that a great flood covered the earth. Now, why would God send a great flood to the earth? Genesis 6:12 gives us the answer. When it says God saw how corrupt the earth had become. All the people on the earth had corrupted their ways. Now, I think, and probably you too, that when corruption becomes widespread, divine judgment often falls. As this podcast begins to wind down, let me just tell you, I've spent this whole podcast today talking about corruption in America, primarily the court systems, the judiciary. And you may be asking as you're listening to this podcast, well, what can I do about this? Well, we can begin by praying that our churches will become a voice for truth and justice in society. And we can pray that God will begin to raise up political leaders that will stand up against corruption. And furthermore, that the Holy Spirit will convict those that have been turning their backs on injustice. And we can pray that just laws will be passed and upheld. Laws that do not allow and prevent rampant corruption. We can pray that the light of truth begins to shine on corruption, exposing unethical, unlawful, and illegal activities. We can pray for the poor and the powerless and the oppressed, that they will receive justice. We can pray that God will intervene on their behalf and protect them from corruption that aims to exploit them. So what I'm saying to you this morning, or whenever you listen to this podcast, is I hope you will include these things in your prayer life. And I want to thank you for watching this podcast today, and I hope you will join us again in the near future. May God bless you.